strain. Was it a bicycle? What is wrong with my brain? Is it the end of me? No, I must still believe. So I'm still in love, you see. Heck yeah, now I'm on my way. But let's stay focused, there's still a job in hand that we must do. Cameras start to click, we know what creating something new. So go Marty and Sarah and Mark and Matt, Owen, Smitty, McCrilly and Jamie Lane in the Archer County Band. The Archer County Band. The Archer County Band. The Archer County Band. Stop the clock, we're done, we're rolling. Sound the horn and sing that we are going. 27 hours, that is the time. So let's hop on the bus and let it shine, 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 shine. Say sha la 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 la, 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 sha la 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 la. Good afternoon, folks. You are very welcome to Bandido Talks. And folks, have we got another interesting show, actually. It's another one of these series reviews. You know, we did one on Deadwood. Fuck, it went on for a long time. You know, hopefully the Bandido can be a little more succinct today. Holy fuck. The last show with Deadwood, I think it went on for over 2 hours. But you know, if the show takes us that way today, folks, we're just going to roll with it. Because what an interesting topic we have today. An interesting review. Because the Bandido, look, it was many years ago when the Bandido watched Avatar, The Last Airbender. You know, we did a show a few months ago on Avatar Aang, and we talked about what he could teach us in the real world. We didn't really dive into the show. We just looked at the concept of being the Avatar in his world, and we tried to figure out what he could teach us practically in our own existence. But you know, today, it's going to be a little bit of a deeper dive, because we have to talk about something very important when it comes to writers who are creating these shows, creating movies, creating TV series, writing fucking books, all this stuff. You know, it's always, folks, I cannot tell you how risky it is whenever you're dealing with relationships. You know, how many writers get relationships wrong. You know, they just don't fundamentally understand. They've got some intuition about man-woman dynamics. They have some intuition. But so many times, I'm watching a TV series, for example, and I'm thinking, you know, this is a good plot. You know, I'm enjoying this, or I'm watching a movie, reading a book, a fictional story, and I'm thinking, this is good. You know, I like this world. And then we get to the romance, and the arse falls out of it. Well, you know, the very first time I watched Avatar, The Last Airbender, I thought the show was magnificent. Magnificent. Then I rewatched it a second time, many years ago. And something didn't sit right with me. And you know what didn't sit right with me? The very last scene with Aang and Katara. Now let me make something clear here. Let me get a few things clear before we get into this. Because we're going to talk about Avatar Aang and Katara in the context of the series. The 3-season series, the 3-book series. I don't want to hear people telling me about the comics, about some other thing that the creators have said after the series has been created. I'm just going to be focusing, this episode of the show, we are going to be focusing only on what the writers decided to show us in the 3 seasons of The Last Airbender. I am not interested in fucking comics or any of this other stuff. I'm just going to deal with what I saw in the 3 seasons. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, I thought the series was magnificent. I have no beef with Avatar The Last Airbender. And by the time we get to the end of the show, you're going to realize why I don't. But you see, on the second rewatch, I actually did have a bit of a beef. And you know what my beef was? It was with that final scene. It didn't sit with me. Aang and Katara. It made no sense to me. And I thought, personally, I thought that the writers had made a big mistake. I thought they had sort of sabotaged their work, actually, on a second viewing. Because when I watched The Last Airbender for a second time and really paid attention to Aang and Katara's dynamic, it didn't make any sense that they get together at the end of the series. Now look, there may be a whole bunch of you that say, but Legend of Korra, he gets together with Katara, they have children, they clearly get together, blah, blah, blah. I'm not talking about what happens after The Last Airbender. I'm talking about what is presented on screen to us during the series. And based on what I saw on screen, it didn't make sense that Aang and Katara get together. We're going to talk about this. However, that was many years ago. Recently, in the last month, I have watched Avatar, rewatched The Last Airbender for a third time. I thought, you know, I did this review on Deadwood. You know, Al Swearingen and all the lads. So I thought, look, in order for me to do a fair review on Avatar, The Last Airbender, and in particular, the romantic dynamics as they are expressed in the series between Aang and Katara, I need to watch the show again from start to finish, and I need to be really paying attention to what it is that the writers are presenting to me on screen. So that's what I did in the last month. And I came to a marvelous conclusion. Absolutely outstanding stuff, folks. You know, I didn't realize on the first 2 viewings, I didn't realize that the writers of Avatar, The Last Airbender, had a bit of Christopher Nolan in them. And indeed they do. I completely overlooked this on the first 2 viewings. But having rewatched it a third time, my reservations about Aang and Katara have completely vanished. And that's not because I think they ought to be together. I don't. There is no way in hell Aang and Katara should be together at the end of the series. I'm going to explain why. It makes no sense from a man-woman, boy-girl romantic dynamic standpoint. It just doesn't make sense. We're going to talk all about it. I'm going to explain my reasoning. But whenever I rewatched the show a third time, I noticed a detail that I overlooked, an off-ramp, as I call it. You know the way whenever you watch a series, folks, and it looks like it's very cut and dry. It looks like it's very, we could say, linear in how it's presented. It looks as if this is the ending, it's black and white, cut and dry, like it or lump it, this is how it is. I don't like when movies do this. I don't like when movies just give me the fucking Hollywood ending, where the main protagonists have a wee kiss at the end. Never like that. Because it's not really that representative of reality. It really isn't. So I like when there's a bit of ambiguity. I like when the writers leave a few blanks for the audience to fill in. I like the idea of the thought not being fully complete, of the idea not being fully complete. This is why I say the writers of Avatar: The Last Airbender have a bit of Christopher Nolan in them. Nolan is the master of this. Now, we did a show about his upcoming movie, The Odyssey. Fuck me. This is where Nolan could have his first stinker. But up until The Odyssey, which I haven't seen yet, but I'm anticipating that it's going to be a stinker for the reasons that we talked about on a show that we did a few weeks ago, Nolan, in most of his work, has this great ability to give the audience off-ramps. In other words, to give the audience alternative explanations for the end of the movie. So Nolan doesn't tend to give you a cut and dry end, black and white ending to his movie. That's so incredibly clear and cannot be disputed. No, Nolan doesn't do that. Nolan leaves a little bit of haziness, a little bit of ambiguity, sometimes a lot of ambiguity, and he allows the audience to participate in the creative process. Because by leaving blanks, by leaving off-ramps and alternative explanations for the ending, the audience feels like they can engage their own imagination. They can stoke their own creative juices and sort of interpret the ending in their own way. In other words, Nolan is the master of making the audience a participant in the creative process, allowing the audience not to be told what to think. Nolan doesn't try to tell the audience what to think. Certainly not up until this most recent movie, which I am very pessimistic about. And the writers of Avatar: The Last Airbender, on the third rewatch, I realized, holy fuck, there was one big off-ramp, there was one big alternative explanation for the end of Avatar that I completely overlooked on the first two viewings. And it makes the entire story make sense to me. Because this relationship between Aang and Katara, as we're going to talk about, it doesn't check out for me. It just doesn't check out. Not from boy-girl, man-woman dynamics. And certainly not as the characters were presented throughout the three-part series. So look, I think Avatar: The Last Airbender is great. It's even better than I thought upon watching it a third time. Even better than I thought. Now, one more thing before we get into this, folks. I'm going to assume, if you are watching this live show, I'm going to assume that you are familiar with Avatar: The Last Airbender and this entire world. So I'm not going to start trying to give summaries of what happens in the plot and who the characters are and how they are related to the main story. I ain't doing any of that. I'm going to assume that you know all there is to know about Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm going to assume that you are very familiar with everything that I have just said with regards to Aang, Katara, and all of this stuff. So I'm not going to start trying to summarize things. If you've clicked into this show, you are familiar with the universe. So I'm just going to talk to you as if you are already up to speed with everything that's happening, or everything that did happen in The Last Airbender. Okay, now, again, I'm going to remind you of this throughout the show. I am basing my conclusions on the 3-season series, not the comics, not anything that the writers have said after the series has completed. I don't care if the writer says that the ending was a real scene or not. I don't care. I am basing it on what I saw in the 3-season series, The Last Airbender. You need to remember this, because I don't, in principle, folks, as you're going to discover, I don't have a problem, in principle whatsoever, with Aang and Katara getting together later on, years down the line. And there are reasons why, as we're going to explore, why I don't have a problem with this. But at the time of the series, I do have a problem with Aang and Katara getting together. If that is in fact what really happened, which I don't think it did happen. And you know, if you've read the description, folks, if you've seen the thumbnail, if you've read the title of the show, you probably know what I'm getting at. But in case you're not, I'll not spoil it too early in the show, but put it like this. I don't think the ending, from my perspective, I'm an audience member consuming this piece of art. And I believe that the writers have left a little offshoot, a little off-ramp, a little alternative explanation from the absolute, widely considered correct, the widely considered ending to the show. The one that everybody considers to be correct. Pretty much everybody thinks that what happened at the end, that final scene with Aang and Katara having their little smooch out over the balcony with the sun setting, everybody thinks that that actually took place in reality. The Bandido ain't so sure, and in fact, if it did take place in reality, it actually undermines for me a lot of what the writers did throughout the show. But I think the writers were clever enough to leave an off-ramp, to leave an alternative explanation. I think they were clever enough to do this. And that's why I call them Christopher Nolan-like. They have left just enough ambiguity for me to satisfy me as a consumer, because the conventional narrative that Aang and Katara gets together at the end of the show does not wash with me at all. But because they have given me this little off-ramp from the cut and dry narrative that everybody else likes to believe, that's good enough for me. We're going to explore this throughout the show. Now, let's get into this. And there's something that we really need to understand. Why is it? Why is it that fundamentally I don't agree with Aang and Katara getting together at the end of the show? Why do I think that actually didn't happen? And that there was something else happening? Well, in order to understand this, folks, we need to understand the nature of man-woman dynamics, but specifically boy-girl dynamics. Because, folks, these people who I see on the forums, I had to do a bit of research here. I had to go and look at this. I went and looked at Reddit and these fucking Avatar fan pages. And everybody is conjuring up these really convoluted fucking reasons as to why Aang and Katara should get together. It's pure cope. They are coping. They cannot accept the fact that, you know the way, folks, when you see something that walks like a duck, it fucking quacks like a duck and paddles like a duck, it's probably a duck. You know the way if your eyes see something that looks like a duck, it has webbed feet, it has a fucking bill, looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, moves like a duck. I mean, it has all the characteristics of a duck. The logical conclusion would be, it's a duck. You're not going to say it's an albatross. You're not going to say it's a pigeon. You're not going to say it's a fucking crow. It's a duck. And you know, these people who try to do these videos or make these comments about Aang and Katara justifying why they get together. Delusion. Absolute delusion. They are creating these convoluted, absolutely unrealistic narratives. Jesus Christ. The show literally tells you, we're going to get into this, the writers literally tell you what Katara thinks. And everybody just ignores it. The Ember Island episode, the one before, you know, the big finale in book 3, she literally tells Aang what she thinks. We're actually going to talk about why Katara has a very delicate balance to strike throughout the show. Very important indeed. But before we get into that, Before we get into Katara and the balance that she has to strike, before we get into this idea of how the characters are actually presented throughout the show, let's just first talk about this idea of boy-girl dynamics over here and man-woman dynamics. Folks, there is a difference between two adults in a relationship or trying to get into a relationship, two fully developed, physically developed and psychologically developed adults. There's a big difference between that over here and two immature teenagers who are psychologically underdeveloped and physically underdeveloped trying to get together in a relationship. Now, folks, don't blame me for how the Last Airbender characters were cast. It ain't my fault, but the writers decided to cast Aang as a 12-year-old, and they decided to cast Katara as a 14-year-old. They decided to make Katara taller than Aang. They decided to make Katara significantly more attractive than Aang. This isn't my fault. This is how they decided to cast. So we need to understand that these are not adults. This is a boy-girl dynamic, not a man-woman dynamic. Yes, there is overlap between the two, but there are distinctions. And let me tell you what the main distinctions are. Whenever you've got two teenagers, two kids in their early teens, Aang is 12, Katara is 14. What we need to understand, first and foremost, is that both Aang and Katara, they haven't yet physically matured, and they haven't yet psychologically matured. This is extremely important to realize. I see these people online, and they talk as though these kids are adults. They are not adults, and it's very important to realize this. This is why I said at the beginning, I have no problem in principle with adult Aang getting together with adult Katara, or at the very least, 17, 18-year-old Aang getting together with fucking whatever it is, 19, 20-year-old Katara. I don't in principle have a problem with that. But a 12 and 14-year-old? Fuck me, folks. Let's get into this. Okay. So first things first. Let's talk about, we have two things to talk about here at the beginning. Being physically immature and being psychologically immature. So let's talk about being physically immature. Folks, when you're 12 and 14 years of age, you have not yet grown into your body. You have not yet fully developed your musculature. You haven't reached your pinnacle height. You haven't yet fulfilled your genetic potential. You're still growing, in other words. So it would be very unfair to look at a 12 or 14-year-old and assume that they are going to, that's their lot, that they're going to look like that for the rest of their life. No, there is still a shit ton of time to pass before either of these two reach physical maturity. Aang is 12, Katara is 14. Now, why is this important to realize? There is a thing, folks, called calibration. What do I mean by calibration? When we are talking about romantic relationships, there's a very important concept called calibration. Now, every person who's trying to get into a relationship must first calibrate themselves. They must first have an understanding of their own physical attractiveness. So that's why every person has a little internal calibration meter. Let me explain what I mean using a simple example. Let's use a scale of 1 to 10. Let's say 1 is extremely ugly, and let's say 10 is unbelievably handsome and beautiful. So let's say we have this scale. 1 is ugly at the very bottom, 10 is unbelievably handsome and beautiful. And then we've got everything in between. Okay. How often, folks, do you see a 2 out of 10 man approaching a 9 out of 10 woman? How often do you see this? I want you to just Look at it from a sheer physical attractiveness point of view. If you're down in the local club, I'm not talking about millionaires, billionaires, all of these people. Forget about resources, forget about status, forget about all of that. Let's just imagine you're down in your local pub. Everyone is earning a basic wage. There are no millionaires and billionaires. Everyone is basically within the same general group, the same general range of income. Everyone more or less has the same level of resources. Okay, how many times do you see a 2 out of 10 man approaching a 9 out of 10 woman? Or vice versa? How often do you see a 2 out of 10 woman approaching a 9 out of 10 man? You don't see it. And the reason why is because everyone has internally calibrated where they sit in the sexual attractiveness marketplace. The 2 out of 10 knows that they are roughly a 2 out of 10. And the 9 out of 10 knows that they are roughly a 9 out of 10. Everybody knows, everybody has a rough idea of where they sit in the marketplace of sexual attractiveness. You don't get a 2 out of 10 miscalibrated and thinking that they are in fact a 9 out of 10. That doesn't happen. Everybody is very aware of where they roughly sit in the marketplace for physical attractiveness. So we have this notion of calibration. So calibration takes place whether you like it or not. Whenever you are thinking about getting into a relationship, you know, you are very aware. You may not be consciously aware, but you are aware, perhaps subconsciously, of where you roughly sit in the sexual marketplace. Let me give you an example from my own perspective. Let's imagine average is 5 out of 10. So let's imagine average is 5 out of 10. I think that I am a 6 out of 10 at best. So I have ran an internal calibration. I'm a 31-year-old man. I'm an adult. Please memory hold that. I'm a 31-year-old man, and I have calibrated based on my physical attractiveness, my facial attractiveness, my physical attractiveness overall. I am a little bit above average. So if average is 5, I'm about a 6. That's roughly where I sit in the marketplace of sexual attractiveness. Okay, so you're not going to see me trying to hit on a 9 out of 10. That's delusional. There's too much of a gulf, a gap in physical attractiveness. Because there will be other 8 and 9 out of 10 males competing against me as a 6. And the female, who's a 9 out of 10, ain't going to be looking at me as a 6, all things being equal. So I'm using this as an example, or in this example, I'm talking about it from the perspective of income is the same, nobody's got a whole bunch of elevated status, influence, and power, no one is the fucking mayor of the town, no one's the king of the country. We're just imagining that we're all roughly at the same socioeconomic status. With all things being equal, and we're just talking about sexual attractiveness, I as a 6, I know my calibration. How do you get calibrated? Maybe your next question. You may then ask, well, Mr. Bandido, how have you arrived at the conclusion that you are a 6 out of 10? Well, let me explain how. Number 1, we have these things, folks, called mirrors. You know the invention that is the mirror? So I can go into my house and I can stare at myself in the mirror. And I can see my own reflection. So I can look at myself in the mirror. I can see my facial features. I can see my body shape. So that's the first reason that I'm able to come to the conclusion that I'm a 6. Because the fact that I can see myself in a crystal clear mirror and the fact that I can take pictures of myself, this allows me to be able to compare my physical appearance to other people. So when I compare myself, 31-year-old Mr. Bandido, to 31-year-old Brad Pitt, I can see when I put either my mirror reflection or an image that I've taken of myself next to Brad Pitt, I can see that I am not as physically attractive as Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt's a 9 or 10 out of 10. Super handsome. And then I can continue to do this process. I can continue to basically compare myself against other men. And then sort of use my own eye to gauge, well, am I as attractive as him? Do I have features that mimic his? So that's the first way in which I'm able to calibrate myself. I have a mirror and I have this ability to take a picture of myself, which allows me to compare my physical attractiveness to other men. The second way in which I'm able to calibrate myself is through experience. I'm 31. I'm an adult. So what I've been able to do across my, let's just say, across my 15 to 20 years of being in relationships, dating women, interacting with women, in those 15 to 20 years, I have got feedback from the sexual marketplace, from the romantic marketplace. I have been able to see the type of woman that I'm able to pull. I can see how attractive the type of woman that I normally pull is. And the best that I can normally do, at a stretch, I can pull a 7. So my past history tells me that at best, I can pull a 7. So I'm a 6. I'm roughly a 6, give or take. Some people might think I'm a 5.5. Some people might think I'm a 6.5. If I've got a really good tan and my hair is just perfect and I'm wearing the absolute right clothes, maybe I could scrape something close to a 7. But I'm basically a 6. And my past history of dating women and interacting with women and getting feedback from women tells me that I'm a 6. The very best that I can pull is a 7. Have I ever been able to pull an 8 out of 10? No. I have to be honest. Because I don't have, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, I'm not a multi-millionaire. I'm not a billionaire. I don't have access to extraordinary wealth like some other people do. Again, I'm competing at the level of the average person. So if I were bringing some extraordinary resources to the table, which we will talk about in a bit, then that would change my mate value overall. But remember, I'm not talking about mate value. I'm talking about sexual attractiveness. Don't mix the two up. So in terms of sexual or physical attractiveness, I'm a 6. My experience tells me that I'm roughly able to bag a 6 or 7 out of 10 in terms of a female. So that is how I've arrived at my conclusion with regards to my calibration of a 6. I can look at myself in the mirror, I can take pictures of myself, compare myself to other males, and look at the features. Do I have some of their features? Am I missing some of their features that make them particularly handsome and attractive? So that's the first way. And then the second way is my experience from the marketplace. The marketplace has given me feedback. And the feedback is that whenever I try to pull a woman, I tend to pull a 6 or a 7. That tends to be what I'm capable of doing in terms of just physical attractiveness. Okay, so we have this concept of calibration. Now, you heard me labor on something earlier. I am a fully grown adult. A fully grown, physically mature, psychologically mature adult. This allows me to properly calibrate myself. Because to be able to calibrate yourself, you need to have the experience part of the equation. If you do not have that, then you're missing very important information. So, whenever we're talking about this particular relationship between a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old, what is it that the 12 and 14-year-old is missing from their calibration mechanism? That's right, they are missing experience. Not only are they missing experience, but they also haven't yet physically developed. So the feedback that they are getting from the marketplace now at 12 or 14 could change in 3, 4, 5, 6 years as they begin to physically mature and as they begin to acquire more experience from the marketplace. What is it that I'm trying to say here? Both Aang and Katara cannot be fully calibrated at the moment. It is impossible for them to be calibrated because they have neither physically developed fully yet, and they have also not got the experience of an adult. Why is the experience important? Because experience gives you feedback from the marketplace. Aang hasn't been in a relationship before. This looks like it's his first woman. And Katara, it doesn't look, based on what we've seen, that she has been in too many relationships either. She's been out isolated in the fucking, where was she, in the South Pole? In one of the isolated water tribes. So we're basically dealing with a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old who, number one, both of whom haven't yet physically matured yet, and number two, they have no dating experience. How can you be calibrated without these two things? So that's the first thing. Neither Aang nor Katara know what their true position is in the physical attractiveness marketplace. They can't know it yet. They are only going to be able to figure this out through physical development and through running experiments. In other words, through dating a whole bunch of people. Through dating a whole bunch of people, you get feedback, and that helps you to calibrate where you sit in the marketplace. Neither of these two have any idea, really, how they are calibrated. And this makes sense. Let me now draw the very first bit of dialogue from the series. Whenever the Aang gang, remember they go to Ember Island and they watch the little theatre show? And remember Aang and Katara are out the back after the show, and Aang's all annoyed because he thinks that Katara, sees him as like a little brother basically, as a really good friend. And remember Aang tries to smooch Katara. What does Katara say? What does she say? She says, "I'm confused, and the timing isn't right." That's Katara's own words. I'm confused. In other words, let me translate what that means. See, when someone says I'm confused, that is code for I am not fully calibrated. I don't know, Mr. Aang, if you are the best option that I have in the marketplace yet, because I am not fully developed yet physically, and I haven't had enough experiments run in the dating arena, so I haven't got enough feedback yet to determine if you are the best catch or not. This is exactly what I would expect from a 12 and 14-year-old. Now let me bring in something else about physical attractiveness. Aang, the way Aang is cast in the series, forget about the comics. I don't care what the comics say. I don't care what you see in The Legend of Korra. I'm focusing only on the series, The Last Airbender. I'm going to keep saying this throughout the show. Aang, 12-year-old Aang, is at best, if I'm being generous, let's say we've got a generous Bandido. At best, he is average. So at best, he's a 5 out of 10. Fuck me. That's me being generous. He's baldy. He's like 4'5". He's a fucking minion. So he's baldy, 4'5". He's not even physically developed yet. He looks like a kid. He doesn't even look like he's hit puberty yet, to be quite honest with you. The way he's cast in the show, I would even dispute if he has even hit puberty. I don't even think he has. And if he has hit puberty, it's very close to the end of the show. But I don't even think he has, to be honest. So Aang, at best, he's really short. He's got a big round baldy head with a big blue arrow. And he isn't particularly muscular. He hasn't filled out. How could he? He's a kid. At best, he's a 5 out of 10. That's me being generous. So at best, he's average. What about Katara? Katara is easily an 8 out of 10. I mean, you have to be fucking blind not to see that. She's taller than Aang. She has developed more in terms of her physical appearance. She has physically matured a little more than Aang, as you would expect. There are 2 years separating both of them. You would expect that. 2 years at that age makes a big difference. A big difference. So Katara is taller than Aang. She is more physically developed than Aang. And in terms of facial beauty and just overall body beauty, she's far more attractive than Aang. Far more attractive. Easily an 8. So folks, if I'm being super generous here, there are at least 3 points of difference between Aang and Katara. Aang is a 5 and Katara is an 8. Now, we've established so far that neither Aang nor Katara are calibrated yet. They can't be. They haven't fully physically matured yet, so you're not actually seeing them. You're not seeing their most representative version yet, because they're still kids. So they haven't physically matured, which means they can't know their true market value until that happens. And then number 2, in addition to that, this looks like it's both of their first relationships, so they have no experience, which means they have no feedback from the marketplace. And if you have no feedback from the marketplace because you've never been on a fucking date before, or you've never been in a relationship, then how can you calibrate yourself? How do you know if Aang is the best option for you out there in the market? Yeah, she doesn't know. And that's why she says, I'm confused. Exactly what I would expect from a 14-year-old who hasn't really been in a relationship before and who is considerably more attractive than the person who's trying to come on to them. I would expect Katara to say she is confused. Perfectly accurate. Well written, actually. Now, let me bring in the second thing. So we've talked about being physically immature and the problems with being physically immature. Let's now talk about being psychologically immature and not being fully developed yet, mentally. Because in case you haven't realized, folks, 12 and 14-year-olds are not fully developed psychologically. You do realize that. There's a big difference, or perhaps I should say there's a noticeable difference between the psychology and behavior of a 12 and 14-year-old compared to a, 22 and 24-year-old, or a 32 and 34-year-old. I'm sure you've all noticed that in your own lives. There's a bit of a difference. Why? Why is there a difference in behavior and worldviews and outlooks? Well, because they are physically immature. But also, because they are psychologically immature. The psychological immaturity is part and parcel of being a child. They are developing. They are kids. Okay, now it's important to realize that both Aang and Katara are psychologically underdeveloped. They are immature. Why is this important to realize? Because I can hear a whole bunch of people saying to me, but Aang, he's the Avatar. The Avatar wins you brownie points. Yeah, it doesn't win you brownie points when you are in your early teens. Let me explain why. You see, whenever you are a 14-year-old girl like Katara, you are psychologically underdeveloped, which means you undervalue the importance of status, power, influence, and resources that the man on the other side of the table is bringing to the relationship. When you are a young teenager, you do not fully appreciate the importance of status, resource acquisition, and resource defense. When you are an immature, underdeveloped, psychologically young person, you do not put the same weight on status and resource acquisition compared to adults. What am I getting at? What I'm getting at is, when you are a young teenager, the bulk of your mate value comes from your physical attractiveness, not your status, not your influence over the world, not the resources that you have at your disposal. Folks, Katara is a kid. She is 14. 14-year-olds haven't yet developed psychologically. They are on the road to maturing psychologically, but they aren't there yet. And anyone who can remember their childhood and trying to, whether you're a man trying, or whether you're a boy trying to chat up women, or women trying to chat up boys, we all know, folks, that when you are in your early teens, nobody really puts enormous value on your status and your resources. You're a kid. You cannot work. You don't have a job. You go to school. You don't have any resources. Your parents have resources. When you're a kid, you don't have the ability to really acquire resources in the same way that an adult does when they go out to work. So the vast majority of a teenager's mate value is in their physical attractiveness. Again, I'll use myself as an example. I'll just talk from my own experience. You see, whenever I was an early teenager, I was really good at sport. We have a sport here in Ireland called hurling. It's basically like hockey, in a way, only you're allowed to pick the ball off the ground and strike it in the air. Go look it up, hurling, Hurling. Okay, so back in the day, whenever I was in my early teens, I was really good at playing hurling. Really good at it. So I was really good at going out onto the field, out onto the pitch, and playing this sport. Now, here's the thing. Whenever I was younger, I was about a 6 out of 10, 5 or 6 out of 10 physical attractiveness. But I was really good at sport. Now, in the team that I played in, there was this other dude who was my same age, the same age as me. He wasn't older than me, and he was not as good at hurling either. I was a better sports person than him. But you know what he had? He was almost 6 foot as like a 14-year-old. He wasn't far off 6 foot. He was like 5'10". He had big Tyrannosaurus Rex muscly legs. He had a big fucking square jawline, and he had a beard. Who do you think got all the women? Do you think it was the little small minion who was really skillful? Or do you think it was the less skillful, big, fucking, adult-looking, handsome 14-year-old who was on my team? Who do you think all the women were interested in? That's right. The big, tall, muscly, handsome, square-jawed 14-year-old. Now, did I have more status than him when it came to the actual execution of the skills of the game? Was I a more highly esteemed hurling player? You could make the argument that I was. But folks, that didn't count for shit. Not when you're in your early teens. Because the female brain at 13 or 14 years of age grossly underestimates the importance of resources and status. it's not that they aren't aware of these things. They are aware of them to some degree, but they get grossly outweighed by physical attractiveness. Folks, I hadn't a hope of, you see those gals who were interested in the big handsome square-jawed dude on my team. I hadn't a hope of getting in with those chicks. No chance. I just was not physically attractive enough. I didn't qualify physically. And you then would say, but, you were like the avatar of your sports team, which is actually true. I was the most skillful player, I would argue. I was the most skillful player. I scored the most. I was the figurehead. I was probably the most important figurehead in the team. Most stuff ran through me. But when it came, folks, when it came to squeaky bum time, when it came to crunch time, you see all that perceived status and esteem that I had as being the best player on the team, it didn't matter. Because the 13 and 14-year-olds whose attention I was competing for, they had their eyes elsewhere. Because they are overwhelmingly interested in looks, in physical attractiveness at that age. So, for all of you that say, but Aang's the avatar, Katara is physically or psychologically immature. She hasn't fully matured yet. And then when we combine her psychological immaturity with her significantly greater physical attractiveness and her lack of experience in the marketplace, we can see, folks, already, by just looking at basic boy-girl dynamics, we can already see that it really doesn't make sense that Aang and Katara get together at the end of the show. It really doesn't. And it's funny, because Katara, the Ember Island episode, that is the most obvious example of rejection. Aang got rejected. That's fundamentally what happened. He got rejected. But this then brings me on to something important that Katara had to do throughout the entire show. Katara had a very delicate balance to strike throughout The Last Airbender. She couldn't be seen to be rejecting Aang outright. Why? Well, it's very obvious. Aang is fucking head over heels for Katara, but Katara is not head over heels for Aang, for all the reasons that we talked about so far. She is far more physically attractive than Aang, and she is to some degree aware of that. She also doesn't have a lot of experience in the dating arena. But even in the show, folks, we see that she has a little sort of fling with Jet. Did Katara look like she was interested in Jet? Fuck yeah! That was far more up Katara's street. Jet completely qualified. Jet was a little bit taller than Katara. He was a similar age to Katara. And Jet is far more handsome than Aang. So as soon as Katara saw Jet, boom, instant chemistry. Completely and utterly physically attracted to Jet. So we even see evidence throughout the show. It's the same with Haru as well, the Earthbender. Now, it's not as strong as the initial connection that Katara has with Jet, but still, Haru is a candidate that's far better suited for Katara compared to Aang. And even Zuko, something similar. Zuko's older than Katara by a year, maybe 2 years actually. Is Zuko 16, 15 or 16? I'm not sure. And Zuko does have experience in the dating arena. He already has a girlfriend, May. So he is experienced. Again, he's just as tall, if not taller than Katara. And again, he's more, in my opinion, he's more handsome than Aang. Fuck me. Aang's a monk, and he's baldy, and he's 12. So, this is the thing. Katara has a very delicate balance to strike here. She can't be seen rejecting Aang, and it's very obvious why. Aang has the most important fight of his life. Not just his life, but for the entire world against Fire Lord Ozai. If Katara were to outright reject Aang, that would devastate him before this all-important fight with the Fire Lord. So obviously, folks, Katara cannot be blunt and honest here. She has to conceal the fact that she isn't physically attracted to Aang. And she has to conceal the fact that she doesn't want to get into a relationship with Aang right now. She literally says it. Remember, folks, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, paddles like a duck, it is a duck. She literally tells Aang. She withdraws from the kiss, tells him she's confused, and then says the timing isn't right. So she kind of tries to not completely reject him, but sort of say, no, you're sort of in with a chance, but just the timing isn't right, and oh, it's on me, I'm confused, I just need more time to think. She's trying to keep Aang in the game. And it's very important that she does that. She has to keep Aang in the game. At the same time, though, Aang is a very perceptive, delicate sort. So if Katara tried to fake her love interest for Aang, he would notice. Aang's a big meditator. He's in touch with his feelings. He's in touch with his emotional side, with his spiritual side. If Katara tried to feign love and interest for Aang, Aang would be able to detect that it is insincere. So that's the reason why Katara can't just, rock with it either. So she has to strike this really delicate balance between not outright rejecting Aang, but also not leaning in and smooching him in an insincere way whereby he would be able to pick up the fact that she doesn't mean it. She has to strike this balance, basically keep him at arm's length on a string so that he isn't demoralized going into his fight with Fire Lord Ozai. She has to make sure that he at least feels like he's in with a shot. That is how I literally interpret Katara's interaction with Aang throughout the entire show. All 3 seasons, pretty much. From very early on, it's pretty clear. Whenever we get to the episode with Aunt Wu, Aunt Wu, where she's this person who predicts all this stuff is going to happen. From that episode, folks, it's like Katara isn't even thinking of Aang. And I know Sokka makes the remark, oh, well, he sort of stimulates Katara's memory, saying that she's going to fall for some powerful bender. Aunt Wu is pulling stuff out of her arse. It's probably not even true. The point is, Katara isn't thinking about Aang romantically. She says that she thinks of him like a younger brother. She says that in the first book. If it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, looks like a duck, paddles like a duck, it is a duck. She literally says he's little brother material. Now you're going to say, oh, the cave of the 2 lovers. Jesus Christ, folks, come on. They are trapped in a cave. They are being hunted by the Fire Nation. They are in a desperate set of circumstances. Katara did what she needed to do to get out of the cave. Does Katara have deep affection for Aang? Of course she does. They've got a very unique, tight bond. How could they not? And because the Avatar world is all spiritual and all of this sort of stuff, it's reasonable to say that they have possibly one of the tightest bonds in the show. That doesn't mean there are romantic feelings, though. And the way I interpret the cave of the 2 lovers is that you are literally seeing the manifestation of Katara's very deep bond and Aang's very deep bond, but his very strong feelings for Katara also. You're seeing that all come together in the melting pot, and that helps them get out. This isn't a mutual exchange of love interests. You've got Aang over here, deep bond, very interested romantically in Katara, and then you've got Katara over here, who's just, very deeply, you could say she's welded to Aang. Her destiny is intertwined with Aang's. The fate of the world, the fate of her own father's survival and her own tribe's survival is intertwined with Aang's survival and success. And you know, she did discover him in the iceberg. They've become great friends, so they do have a tight bond. Of course they do. And I think you're just seeing a non-romantic kind of love and affection and bond that's coming from Katara. And yes, you know, she's just throwing out ideas. How about we kiss Aang? Maybe that will help us get out of this dire circumstance. Is that coming from a place? Is that coming from a place of, you know, unfiltered, raw, raging love for Aang in a romantic sense? Fuck no. Of course it's not. It's completely circumstantial. Katara is being pragmatic. That's how I look at it. She's being pragmatic. She's looking at the circumstance. They are trapped in a cave. They are in trouble. Neither of them can earthbend. They are in trouble. They could get, if they are trapped in here for long enough, they could die. So they have to figure out a way to get out. So Katara, being pragmatic and thinking strategically, thinks, okay, maybe if we kiss, maybe that'll do the job. And then, you know, you've got this melting pot of Aang's romantic feelings, Aang's bond with Katara, Katara's bond with Aang, but lack of romantic feelings, in my opinion. It all comes together and it lights up the cave. Okay, that's how I interpret that. I don't think there is mutual love interest there at all. I really don't. I just think it's Katara being pragmatic and doing whatever it takes to get out of the circumstance, because she knows that her fate, the fate of her people, the fate of the world, depends on Aang being successful. So she's just going to do whatever it takes so that Aang is successful. And we see this as the show goes on, folks. We really do. You see it whenever Katara and Zuko are heading on Appa towards Azula in order to fight Azula. Zuko's saying to Katara, oh, you know, will Aang have the guts to take down my father? Did you see any romantic feelings from Katara whenever Zuko expressed this? Did Katara look like she was really concerned for her boyfriend-to-be, for the love of her life? No! She had a big stony face. Go look at it back. Go look back on the episode. She had a big stony face and she said, Aang has to do it. There's no other option. I didn't see any, you know, emotional investment from Katara, thinking that the love of her life was going to die. No, she looked like she had business to do. Again, let's go back to the day of, what was it, the day of Black Sun, whenever Aang kisses Katara. What happens? Did Katara look like she was overjoyed that the love of her life finally made the move and initiated a little smooch? No! She looked embarrassed. Why? Why do I think she was embarrassed? She was embarrassed because now she realizes that Aang is coming on strong. And there's a mixture of embarrassment because she's having to now figure out, you know, how do I conceal what it is that I'm thinking here? And she blushes. There's an embarrassed blush because she knows that she's telling Porky Pies. She knows that she's stringing Aang along. And whenever Aang makes the move, you know, very sincere, very earnest, he leans in for a wee smooch. Katara is sort of in this impossible position. What does she do? She has to sort of thread the line, thread the needle very carefully here. She has to give Aang the illusion that she's still interested without appearing insincere. Very difficult. And that's why you see the reaction that you see. Now, I know some of you are going to say, but Katara doesn't want to have a relationship during war. Bollocks. Absolute bollocks, folks. Did that stop Sokka and Suki having a relationship during war? Did that stop Sokka and Princess Yue having a relationship during war? Does Zuko and Mei look like they were, you know, very perturbed about an ongoing war? There are plenty of relationships in the show, folks, that take place during the war. doesn't matter if there's a war going on or not. The point is, if you have two people who are head over heels for one another, it doesn't matter what the fuck is going on around them. You see this nonsense of, oh, well, Katara didn't want to get together with Aang because she was looking that the war was on and she wanted to make sure everybody was focused. Yeah, you know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like someone who is not actually attracted to Aang romantically. That sounds like someone who's trying to thread the needle. That sounds like someone who's trying to get the balance right. That sounds like someone who is not head over heels in love with someone else who clearly has those feelings for them. Because folks, if you meet someone, we all know this from our past experience, when you meet someone and you qualify for them and they qualify for you, the romance is instant. And when I say instant, I mean we aren't waiting months for this thing to blossom. Oh no, it is pretty much instant. There is instant chemistry, there is mutual interest in having this thing be established. That's what happens when you get two people, even two teenagers, that are head over heels for one another. It's instant. It's even more instant when you're a teenager. Teenagers don't overthink things. It's very simple. Do you qualify physically? Do I find you physically attractive? If you find me physically attractive and I find you physically attractive, boom, it's instant. We don't have to wait for months for the relationship to simmer and take its own time. Anybody who tells you that crap does not, I don't know what they're smoking. I really don't. I don't know what version of man-woman dynamics they have in their head, or boy-girl dynamics. Because when you're a teenager, folks, I go back to what I said earlier. It is all pretty much on your physical attractiveness, for the reasons that I've explained. When you have very little dating experience, it's very hard to know what feedback you're getting from the marketplace. So it makes it very difficult to calibrate yourself. When you're not physically mature yet, it's very difficult to calibrate yourself. And when you're psychologically immature, you undervalue the role that status, power, influence, and resources play in the overall mate value equation of a person. And Katara is significantly more attractive than Aang. She's taller than him, she's more physically developed than Aang, facially more attractive, and in terms of her body, more attractive. I mean, what are all these other people looking at? And there are so many examples from the show. You've got the Ember Island, you've got the Day of Black Sun, you've got the Cave of the Two Lovers. You know, you've got Katara literally telling Aang that she's confused and that the time isn't right. The time isn't right. In other words, you don't qualify at the moment, Aang. You might qualify in a few years, but right now, you don't qualify. That's what the timing isn't right means. And when Katara says that she's confused, that is basic language for saying the following. When someone says they are confused, that means they aren't fully calibrated yet. When you have a teenager that's confused, they aren't calibrated. In other words, they don't know exactly where they sit in the market of physical attractiveness yet. And if they don't fully understand where they sit, then they may be overestimating or underestimating what they are capable of bagging when it comes to a romantic partner. Katara is looking at Aang, and her intuition is telling her, I can do better than this. That's what her intuition is telling her. I can get a physically more attractive specimen than Aang. We see this with Jet. Jet is far more physically attractive. A much better match for Katara. And of course, folks, what happens? Does it take Katara, a few weeks or a few months to connect with Jet? No, it is instant. Instant. That is what happens when you're in your early teens. It's all on physical attractiveness. It really is. It's pretty much all on physical attractiveness. Now, it gets really interesting, folks, whenever we think about all of this and then we consider the ending of the show. Now, I don't know if any of you, I'm sure some of you have noticed this, but you will remember that Aang and Katara, the last time they speak, is in part 1 of Sozin's Comet. Remember when they're out having their little sort of beach party? And remember Zuko attacks Aang? And then Aang gets all bent out of shape because he doesn't want to kill Fire Lord Ozai, but, you know, everybody else pretty much thinks that that's what he needs to do. And Aang gets really annoyed. And the last interaction that Aang, the last verbal exchange on screen that Aang has with Katara is an argument. Aang says something like, well, Katara, if you can think of a better way for me to fight Ozai, I'd love to hear it. And then he storms off. Something like that. And then, of course, he walks out onto the lion turtle and they never talk again. There is no dialogue between Aang and Katara for the rest of the series. That's it. So from part 1 of Sozin's Comet, part 2, Katara's away off with Zuko and the gang. Part 3, Katara and Zuko are fighting Azula. Part 4, Aang and Katara never speak. The only thing that we have is this scene at the end where Aang goes out onto the balcony, Katara comes out behind him, they don't say a word, and then they have their smooch. Has anybody ever noticed that? Has anybody ever noticed that the last time Aang and Katara talked was an argument, and from that point, the writers deliberately, I have to assume, they deliberately decided to show zero interaction between Aang and Katara. Zero. Until the last scene. Now, if you've understood and followed so far my logic, I'd love to know where I've got things wrong. You know, put it down in the comments if you think I've got something wrong. Because, you know, if we think about teenage relationships, all of you folk out there who are analysing Aang and Katara from the perspective of an adult relationship, you are viewing this incorrectly. You need to look at it from the perspective of a teenage relationship, early teenage romantic relationship. Folks, when you've got one party significantly more attractive than the other party, Katara is at least an 8 out of 10, Aang is a 5. Katara is more physically developed than Aang, and she's also more mature than Aang. Katara isn't calibrated. Aang isn't calibrated. Neither of them have actually reached their full physical maturity or their full psychological maturity. They aren't calibrated. They haven't had experience in the dating market. And this all makes sense, folks. Katara's absolute hesitation completely makes sense for 2 reasons. Reason 1 being, she isn't attracted to Aang romantically. If it walks like a duck, paddles like a duck, sounds like a duck, it's a duck. They are literally, the writers are literally giving us dialogue between the two where Katara is clearly rejecting Aang. She clearly doesn't see him as a romantic partner. And even in the cave of the two lovers, and perhaps actually I could argue here, I could argue that, again, in the cave of the two lovers, even though the story goes that it is romantic love that causes the pathway to light up, that causes the tunnels to light up, again, Aang is the avatar. And this is a spiritual magic world. It doesn't work like our world here in reality. So, do you actually need both parties to have the same burning, intense romantic love to light the pathway? Or in Magic Avatar world, is it just enough for the Avatar, the most powerful person in that world, to have strong feelings for someone else, and for that other person to have a very deep bond with Aang? Is that enough to just cause the lights? The pathway to light up out of the tunnels? You know, we're talking about a magical world here, folks. A spiritual world. Things don't work exactly as they work here. In our life, in our world. So, that is probably, you know, I could almost imagine one of the big arguments that someone's going to throw back at me is, well, if there isn't mutual romantic interests here, why did the cave light up? Now, there are two reasons for this. The first reason could be what I've just said. It's funny, magical Avatar world, and maybe Aang's very intense romantic feelings for Katara are enough in combination with Katara's deep bond for Aang. Maybe that's enough to just light the pathway. The second explanation could be that the writers have just misunderstood. In my opinion, they've misunderstood. At that stage of the show, they have misunderstood the portrayal of their dynamic. They've got a little bit lost. And they've made a wee bit of an error in terms of the dynamic between Aang and Katara, because they definitely rectify this later. The Day of Black Sun is pretty conclusive to me. If two people feel an intense, raging, burning love, romantic interest for one another, goodness gracious me, as soon as Aang smooched Katara, if Katara truly felt the same way as Aang, they would have embraced as intensely as you would have expected. But that is not what happened at all. So that's the start of it. And then as we go forward from that point, Ember Island is very conclusive. And then the way they actually finish the show with no dialogue between Aang and Katara at all in the final 3 episodes. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do Aang and Katara actually speak in the final 3 episodes? I don't think they do. There's not a word exchanged between the two of them. So, you know, the Cave of the Two Lovers, that is, you could easily say that that is the strongest argument you have against what I'm saying. But I think that could be very easily chalked down to those two explanations. Either the writers just have made an error in the portrayal of their dynamic, the dynamic between Aang and Katara, which they rectify later, or it's Magic Avatar world. And things don't work in a conventional sense, not in the way that we would see them working. And perhaps Katara's very pragmatic approach, she was able to draw on her very strong bond for Aang, but also her very strong desire to have Aang succeed. And maybe all of this comes together when you bring together Aang's very intense feelings, romantic feelings for Katara. Maybe this is just enough to light the pathway. I don't know. It could, though, be an error from the writers, because that's the only thing. The Cave of the Two Lovers is, if the writers aren't using this as a sort of nuanced, magical Avatar landscape thing, and they genuinely think that Aang and Katara have romantic feelings to the point where they're able to light the pathway, that doesn't fit with me. That contradicts some of the stuff that they do later. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's just pragmatic Katara. I think Katara is just being pragmatic. She's looking at the circumstance and she's doing whatever it takes. She's doing whatever it takes. Because remember, folks, by Katara signaling to Aang that she may want to kiss him, that gets Aang very excited. So that gets his engine running a little bit hotter still. And because he's the Avatar and he's Mr. Spiritual and all of this sort of stuff, again, in that universe, that may have been enough to just ignite the entire fucking tunnel and get it full of light. You know, Katara, you could easily make the argument that Katara is actually playing Aang in the Cave of the Two Lovers. That's what I'm really trying to say. You could make that argument. She's playing on Aang's intense feelings for her. And she's sort of revving up Aang's engine. leading him on a bit, sort of saying, how would you feel, if we were to share a kiss, maybe that might do the job. And Aang gets really excited. And then, they sort of lean in. They lean in. Is Katara really going to kiss him? Or is she leaning in towards Aang to give Aang the illusion that she's going to kiss him so that the fucking tunnel will light up? That would be, if I had to go with an explanation, it would be that. I really think this is just another example of Katara threading the needle, doing what she has to do to get Aang into the position that he needs to be in to take on the Fire Lord. Because as I've already said, a demoralized, dejected, rejected, depressed Aang is an absolute disaster going into this final battle. A complete disaster. We see, whenever Aang is with, what's he called? Guru Patik? Is that what he's called? The guru that helps Aang to open up his chakras? You can see Aang is head over heels for Katara. Completely head over heels. He really is. He is so invested in a relationship with Katara. And you can see from that episode, in particular, you can start to get a feeling for just how devastated Aang would be if Katara rejected him. And that's the thing. I think Katara she's astute. And when you think of the Aunt Wu episode, Katara is describing, again, she's literally describing a jet-like person. She's basically describing a jet. Someone like Jet, someone like Zuko even. When she's talking with Aunt Wu, she isn't describing Aang. She's not describing a 12-year-old who is 2 years younger than her, more physically immature, more psychologically immature, and needy and desperate. Because Aang is needy and desperate. He knows that he doesn't qualify. Deep down, he knows that it's an uphill battle. We even see this in Book 2. Whenever there's a suggestion made, whenever Jet gets his memory altered, or he gets hypnotized, I think. Remember Sokka made the suggestion that, maybe if we get Katara to kiss Jet, maybe that will revive his memory of who he was. And Aang was sort of off to the side saying, yeah, I think that's a terrible idea. Aang knows. He knows this is an uphill struggle. He's very keenly aware that he isn't qualifying. But Katara does a good enough job of stringing him along so that he gets to the final battle with Ozai, thinking that he's still in with a chance with Katara, thinking that he still has some skin left in that game. So this is how I broadly think of this entire Aang-Katara relationship. It's basically Katara steering Aang, giving him the illusion that he can get together with her when all of this finishes, when in reality, she wants to make sure that he has an incentive to fight Ozai with all of his strength and all of his power. Because, again, you can see how invested Aang is in Katara. It's very clear. He's very needy. He's very desperate, we could say, to make this work. And he's very insecure about it. Like, folks, that's the first time I've actually used that word. Why do people feel insecure in relationships? Would we all agree, folks? Does Aang look insecure when it comes to his potential relationship with Katara? Answer yes or no. Now, anybody who says he looks secure is a fucking idiot. They are completely deluded. Completely deluded. Aang does not look one bit secure. He looks like he is paranoid and anxious, needy, desperate, and overall stressed out about the relationship. He's insecure. What leads to insecurity, folks? What leads to insecurity in a relationship? You feel insecure in a romantic relationship, if you are getting cues that you do not qualify, that is why you feel insecure. You feel insecure if the person on the other end is sending you signals that you do not fully qualify. If Aang were getting signals that he qualifies, he wouldn't be insecure. He would feel more confident. He would feel less needy, less desperate, less anxious. But he doesn't feel that way. He feels insecure right the way throughout the entire series. He knows that this is an uphill battle. And I think Katara does an excellent job, all in all. Because remember, it's not just good enough for Katara. She can't fake it either. She can't lean in and start kissing Aang. She can't do that. Because it would come across as insincere. Aang, as I've already said, is Mr. Sensitive. Mr. In touch with my emotions and feelings and my chakras and my spirituality. Aang, as the Avatar, would be able to pick up that Katara is being insincere. In fact, we can see that whenever Toph starts to teach Aang how to sense people's movements, people's vibrations through the ground, Aang starts to get better at this. So if Katara was being insincere, it's quite likely a little bit like Toph. You know the way Toph is able to detect if someone is lying or not, depending on how their body is vibrating through the ground? Aang starts to develop this ability, and we actually see with the final fight with Ozai, he does this exact thing. When he has his back turned to Ozai, and Ozai goes to attack him, he knows where Ozai is. He knows what Ozai's doing. So we can start to see that throughout the show, Aang is starting to get better at earthbending. He's starting to become more competent. And so, while Aang may not be at the level of earthbending that Toph is, and while he may not be able to sense someone's vibrational energy quite as accurately as Toph, he will be able to sense some of it. And if Katara starts trying to fake a relationship with Aang, he would, I am sure, he would be able to sense that it's insincere. And that would be the definitive feedback then. As soon as Aang would have detected that Katara was being insincere, that's it. It's case closed. There's no more remedy that can be provided. There's not a remedy now. At this point, once Aang would get that feedback that Katara is faking it, fuck me. It's a shutout. It's case closed completely. So Katara can't afford to fake it either. She has to thread the needle. She has to keep him on a string. And that's what I think you're seeing throughout this entire show, including the cave of the two lovers. I think you're seeing it there too. So look, that is broadly my case. I've tried to lay this out. I am not viewing Aang and Katara as an adult relationship. If it was an adult relationship, that would be different. Because now we would be able to bring in the concept of status, resource acquisition, and resource defense. These things can start coming into the equation because we're talking about adults now. And adults are fully developed psychologically. But when we're talking about kids in their early teens, they are always going to underestimate, undervalue the importance of status, influence, power, and resources. How could it be any other way, folks? They are juveniles. They are kids. They are, of course, going to underestimate this. So I'm not viewing Aang and Katara with my man-woman dynamic lens. I'm looking at it as a boy-girl relationship. In other words, a teenage relationship. A relationship between two kids in their early teens. Aang isn't even a teenager. He's 12. So he's not even a teenager. And I actually think, again, I'm going to repeat this, I don't even think Aang has hit puberty. And if he has, he's barely hit it. Barely hit it. Katara, though, I've tried to lay this out from a boy-girl romantic relationship standpoint. You cannot be calibrated when you're that age. You just can't be. You cannot know where you sit in the marketplace of physical attractiveness or your overall mate value. You cannot know where you sit in the marketplace at 12 or 14 years of age because you haven't yet physically matured and you haven't yet psychologically matured. Until those two things happen, you will not fully understand your absolute mate value and physical attractiveness being part of that mate value. And also, when you're 12 or 14, like Aang and Katara, and it's your first relationship, this looks like it's Aang's first relationship, and it also looks like it's Katara's first relationship. When you're dealing with teenagers in their first relationship, they have no experience in the dating arena, which means they do not have a sufficient sample size of market feedback. And if they don't have sufficient feedback from the dating arena, they aren't going to be able to fully calibrate. And this is why the dialogue is great. I love the choice of dialogue by the writers. I think the choice of dialogue is fabulous. Katara says she's confused and that the timing isn't right. What more is there to say? And then, yeah, Aang and Katara never exchange words beyond part 1 of Sozin's Comet. There's never an interaction. There's never an exchange of words. Does that look like two people who are head over heels in love with one another? Folks, as soon as the war would have finished, would it not be logical to think that if Aang and Katara mutually, if there was a mutual love interest here from both parties, would it not be logical to think that as soon as Ozai is defeated, that Katara would be all over Aang? Would that not make sense? You know, the war is now over. So, you know, for all those people out there who say, oh, Katara, you know, she just didn't want to get into our relationship because the war was on. All right. So see, when the war finished, why was she not all over Aang? Why did we not get evidence on screen? The writers chose to omit this, folks. We're going to come to the end of the show now, and this is important. The writers decided to omit any verbal, physical exchange between Aang and Katara after Sozin's Comet Part 1. Do you think that is a coincidence? Do you think that's by accident? Do you think if two people were truly head over heels, I've got a her. I always end up with a her on my mouth. Let me get rid of that. Always happens, folks. But if you think that two people who were as invested in one another, do you think if you had two people who fully qualified for one another, who had the same mutual love interest, two people who were as head over heels about one another as the other was, do you think these people would be, you know, not shown on screen to be demonstrating their love for one another now that the war has finished? Why would the writers not just show us, as soon as Aang defeats Ozai, and they go back to the Fire Nation, where Prince Zuko is becoming Fire Lord, why is Katara out in the crowd and Aang is up on stage, and why are they not talking with one another? Why are they not smooching one another? Why are they not head over heels for one another? You know, we've got the big euphoric release now, folks. The war's over. Should there not be just an outpouring of suppressed... Should there not be an outpouring of suppressed romantic love? Should we not see this? Fuck me. What happens? So what happens, folks? Well, here's what happens. We get this scene back at Uncle Arrow's tea shop. There's this sort of hazy lighting. You know, after Prince Zuko gets crowned Fire Lord, and Prince Zuko goes down and asks Fire Lord Ozai where his mother is, you know, after all of that finishes, and Zuko and Aang have their embrace as friends, you know the way we go back to Uncle Arrow's tea shop in Ba Sing Se. So we're not even in the Fire Nation anymore. We're in Ba Sing Se, which means if this is real, everybody has had to go and change their clothes, leave the Fire Nation, travel on Appa over to Uncle Arrow's tea shop in Ba Sing Se. So you're telling me that since Aang has defeated Ozai, in the period between defeating Ozai and Zuko being crowned Fire Lord, there's no interaction with Katara, and then you're also going to tell me that between Zuko being crowned Fire Lord and them making their way back to Uncle Arrow's tea shop in Ba Sing Se, that there's still no interaction with Katara? So we make our way back to Uncle Arrow's tea shop in Ba Sing Se. Everybody seems to be wearing different clothes. And it's a little bit weird, folks. Because, you know, on a third watch, you know, many years later now, I've got a much better eye for details in movies and TV series. And, you know, as soon as I started to think about that final scene at Uncle Arrow's tea shop, you know what started to come into my head? Christopher Nolan started to come into my head. You know the way Christopher Nolan loves to end his movies with ambiguity? You know the way he loves to end his movies without this sort of black and white conclusion? Well, that started to come into my head. And I'm looking at this scene and I watch all of the gang in the tea shop. Uncle Arrow's playing his horn. Aang leaves. And he goes out onto the balcony. And the sun is setting. And the lighting is very strange, let's just say. It is unusual lighting. It is lighting that I haven't really seen in the series to date. It's just, you know, it's just what my eye sees. It looks like very warm lighting. You know, very warm, very cozy. There's almost like a little haze to it, almost. You know, like you've got a filter on. You know the way you can put filters on your videos? And you can put a filter on called warmth or something like that. You know the way if you put that filter, if you move the little fader up, it sort of creates this orange glow? Have you ever did this on your videos? And it gives this sort of dreamy feel. It can give a sort of dreamy feel. And you know, you've got the sun setting, and even the way everyone is interacting in Uncle Arrow's tea shop, it's all a bit odd looking. Uncle Arrow looks like he's put on 50 pounds. He looks like he's fat. You know, are you telling me that in a couple of days, after Uncle Arrow looking ripped and chiseled, breaking through the walls of Ba Sing Se to restore the Earth Kingdom, you're telling me that Uncle Arrow has went from that to being basically fat and obese again? Because that's how it looked to me. He looked pretty chubby in the tea shop. And everybody's acting a bit weird. Everybody's just kind of sitting there. They're in different clothes. It looks a bit surreal. It looks as if it isn't taking place in reality. And then you've got this warm golden glow, this filter that's across the screen. As if the warmth has been turned up 50%. Aang goes out onto the balcony. And then Katara follows Aang out. And for some reason, they don't say a word to one another. Because isn't that what happens, folks? Isn't that what 12 and 14-year-olds do? They just go out onto the balcony, don't say anything to each other, and then they just glance at one another and have a passionate smooch. Isn't that what 12 and 14-year-olds do? In reality, isn't that what happens? They saunter out onto the balcony, they look at one another, they weigh one another up. They haven't talked to one another on screen since Sozin's Comet Part 1 when they were at Ember Island on the beach. So, they don't say a single word. There's not a word exchanged. And then they have the euphoric, passionate smooch. Because isn't that exactly what a 12 and 14-year-old would do? And isn't that exactly what a 14-year-old girl would do when she's got someone who is significantly shorter than her, whom she has been rejecting for the past number of seasons, who has shown no romantic interest in Aang? Whenever Zuko asked Katara if Aang's gonna have the guts to take out his father, Katara had a big stony face, focused on the job. Aang will take care of that. He has to take care of it. There was no emotionality in Katara's face. She didn't look like she was concerned for the love of her life. Not at all. But yes, that's right. Despite all that happening, and despite what happened at the little theatre show on Ember Island, Katara saying that she was confused and that, the timing wasn't right. All of a sudden now, you would just walk out onto the balcony, not utter a word, and because you're taller than Aang, you have to fucking kneel down to kiss the dude, and that's what you would do. Because that's what teenagers do. What world are we living in here, folks? Because let me tell you what I think. We have been given evidence throughout the entire show, and this is for me the genius of the writers of Avatar: The Last Airbender. We have been given evidence, and a lot of it throughout all of the seasons, that Aang frequently falls into a dream state. He does this frequently. He did it with Monk Gyatso. He actually does it. He actually does it in an episode in Book 3. Remember, it was called Dreams and Nightmares or something? Remember the episode where he keeps dreaming of Ozai? He keeps dreaming of this version of Ozai that he's fighting. He's having a nightmare, I should say. Remember in that episode, remember Aang fantasizes about kissing Katara. The seed has already been sown, folks. Can you not see it? The writers are literally offering the off-ramp. They are offering the alternative. Throughout the entire show, Aang frequently falls into a daydreaming dream state in general. He daydreams, and at times he literally will fall into a dream state. And he will invent stuff in his mind that actually hasn't happened in reality. We literally see it, folks. Aang conjures a scene in his own head whereby he takes Katara and kisses her in his own head. And you'll remember what happens in that episode. Aang's doing all this in his head, and Katara's off to the side going, Aang, what are you doing? And Aang gets snapped back into reality again. And he goes, nothing, I was just dreaming of something else. Folks, the writers have been planting this seed all along. As far back as Book 1. Aang hallucinates, he daydreams, he falls into dream states, He falls into nightmare states. This happens all the time. He goes into the spirit realm as well. You know, how often is Aang actually not in reality? Sometimes he's in the spirit realm, sometimes he's in his own head. In other words, everything isn't always as it seems in Avatar world when it comes to Aang. Aang will frequently make stuff up in his own head. And this is where I think the Christopher Nolan-like writing has come into the equation. And I only really realized this on a third viewing. Because there has always been a strangeness when you think of it. There's a strangeness about Aang and Katara's relationship. And there are these people online that fucking make up these convoluted explanations as to why they are a good couple. Makes no sense. It really doesn't. Not from boy-girl relationships as teenagers. It really doesn't. So there's always been this strangeness. But whenever I rewatched Avatar for a third time, it made sense to me. I just didn't pick it up before. What the writers have done is the writers have given the audience their cake so that they can eat it. For the people who want Aang and Katara to be an item at the end of the show, the writers have given them that possibility. They've given them the scene at the end where they have the Hollywood finale, romantic kiss, lovely jubbly, happy days, sail off into the sunset. They give the people that option, but you see, for the people like me who don't buy Aang and Katara, not at the series, not when we're talking about the 3-season series. Again, what happens afterwards, folks, I'm not talking about. I've already explained that Aang and Katara are both physically immature and psychologically immature, and they have no experience in the dating market. So, in other words, neither of them are calibrated, but especially for Katara. Katara knows that she could do better than Aang. She knows. She's got a little bit of market feedback with Jet and Haru, and even Zuko. She knows that she could do better than Aang. And because she is psychologically immature, she doesn't value status, power, influence, avatar of the world in the same way that her adult version will. Because that's one of the drawbacks of being psychologically immature. You underestimate the importance of those things. And Aang, as we've already talked about, is tremendously insecure about his relationship with Katara. Why would someone be insecure about a relationship? Because they are getting signals that they are not qualifying. Katara is, whether she wants to or not, we are completely unable to stop ourselves from emitting signals of defection, folks. It happens in your body language, it happens in your word choice, it happens in the words that you decide to omit. It's as much to do with what you say as what you don't say. And you cannot control your facial expressions, your body language to that level. If you aren't into someone, the person on the other end will sense your defection cues. We are built to notice these things, folks. And Aang is feeling insecure because he is getting signals from Katara that he doesn't qualify. That's what he says to Katara on Ember Island. Oh, you do see me as a little brother. Oh, you do see me as a friend. You don't see me as your boyfriend, blah, blah, blah. He knows it. And Katara, because she has to thread the needle, she has to kind of, massage Aang's ego to a degree. She has to sort of keep him at distance enough so that he doesn't pick up her insincerity. But at the same time, she can't be too distant, otherwise she's going to demoralize him. And so what ends up happening? By the time we get to the end of the show, folks, when we think about boy-girl dynamics, when we think about what Katara has said to Aang throughout the show, when we think about how insecure Aang is, when we consider that Aang and Katara are shown to have no on-screen dialogue for the last 3 episodes, literally the climax of the show, Aang and Katara do not talk to one another. They don't even really have a meaningful interaction beyond the final scene, which I think is a dream. Surprise, surprise, folks, we've made it there after an hour and 53 minutes. Folks, the final scene in Avatar, to me, makes perfect sense if we view it as a dream. Just look at the lighting of the scene, look at the filter that's being used, look at the warmth of the lighting. It's this sort of comfortable, secure, warm lighting. Everybody's in Uncle Iroh's tea shop. Uncle Iroh looks like he's put on 50 pounds. He's expanded at the waistline. Everybody in Uncle Iroh's tea shop has changed their clothing. They're no longer at the Fire Nation Temple or the Fire Lord's Palace. Everybody's acting a bit weird. Aang and Katara go out onto the balcony. They don't talk to one another. They just look at one another. They have a wee blush, and then they have a smooch. The sun sets. It goes to white. Notice that, folks. It goes to white. As soon as they kiss, it goes to white, and it says the end. Folks, to me, this is a dream. Aang, we have been given evidence throughout the entire series from season 1 to season 3. We have been given ample evidence that Aang conjures up little notions in his head. He makes stuff up in his own mind that isn't representative of reality. We literally get an episode dedicated to this. It's irrefutable. It's undeniable. Aang frequently lives what we see on screen at times. We are seeing Aang living in his own head, conjuring up images that aren't real. And I think by the time you get to the last scene of Avatar, The Last Airbender, what you are seeing is, once Prince Zuko gets crowned Fire Lord, and once Prince Zuko goes down to Ozai and demands that he tells him where his mother is, you see, from that point, folks, reality has ended. The show has ended in reality. What you then see happening at Uncle Iroh's tea shop, in my opinion, is a dream sequence that Aang is making up in his own head. He is imagining the end to the war that he would have wanted. Here's what I think actually happened in reality. I think when the war finished, Aang and Katara didn't get together. I don't think that happened. Aang and Katara remained very good friends, part of Team Avatar, with a very close bond, but not a romantic one. Not yet. Not at this stage. Aang is 12, Katara is 14. We've talked in depth why this is an issue. Why their relationship doesn't mix. Why, when you're a teenager, it's basically all on physical attractiveness. And if Katara is at least an 8 out of 10, and Aang at best is a 5 out of 10, they do not match in a compatible fashion. Katara knows this, and Aang knows this as well because he's feeling insecure. So I think what you're seeing is, you're seeing Aang conjuring up a little dream sequence of how he would have liked the ending of the war to have played out. What I think happened in reality was they stayed friends. There was no romantic relationship initially. Now, that doesn't mean that later on, as Aang starts to fill out, starts to physically mature, starts to better calibrate himself, starts to get more market feedback, starts to become more psychologically mature, same with Katara, there's no reason why they can't end up together. I don't have a problem in principle with that. But in terms of the show, folks, I see this as a dream. And to be honest, when I view it through that lens of a dream, the entire thing makes sense. Because one thing that I do notice, you see when you go onto these forums, these Avatar fan pages, people have a very hard time explaining Aang and Katara's romantic relationship. Go on to the forums and look it up. Look at some of these long-winded, fucking convoluted explanations. It is bizarre how people try to justify what they see in the final scene. It's a bit like, think of it like, remember back in 2020? Remember back in 2020 there was the big pandemic and you were being told, you need to socially distance, you need to put a mask on, you need to inject yourself with this, you need to, not visit your grandma, you need to allow your grandma to die in a nursing home, you can't have a proper send-off for your loved ones, blah, blah, blah. Remember you were told all this. Well, all you had to do, folks, was use your eyes. That's all you had to do to work out if this virus was a legitimate threat or not. You just had to use your eyes. I didn't see anybody dropping dead out on the street during the event in 2020. I never got ill. None of my people around me got ill. I didn't know anybody who had an adverse, serious reaction to the virus. I know plenty of people who had a serious adverse reaction to the stuff that they took to try and prevent the virus that they were convinced to take. I never saw anybody suffer a serious adverse reaction to the virus itself. If it looks like a duck, folks, if it walks, quacks, and paddles like a duck, it's a duck. When I looked at the pandemic, it looked to me, after a very short period of time, we're talking here a month. After a month, it looked to me like this is not dangerous. It looks like the flu. That's what my eyes told me. Now, everybody else was telling me, no, it's this is this strain, and this strain can mutate, and if you don't get this injection, and if you don't socially distance 2 meters, and if you don't do, double mask. I was being told if I didn't do all these things, that I would get sick, and that the people around me would get sick, and that I would be a bad citizen of the world. That's what I was told. In other words, people started to conjure up big, convoluted reasons as to why this virus is super dangerous. I just used my eyes, and after a month, I decided I'm going to visit my grandmother. I'm just going to get on with life as normal. I ain't worried. It's the same thing here, folks. People are trying to find an explanation for Aang and Katara that does not exist. They are making things so complicated. You have to go through such a complicated explanation to arrive at the conclusion that Aang and Katara is a good match. To me, the writers have done a brilliant job. And the reason why is because, you see, for all the chicks, you see, for all the gals out there who want the wee romantic Hollywood ending, they've given them that. They give them the smooch at the end. All right, to keep those people happy. But the brilliance of the writers is that they gave an off-ramp. They did something that Christopher Nolan would do. They introduced just enough ambiguity, not just in the final scene with Uncle Arrow's tea shop and all the weirdness that's going on there, but throughout the entire series. They have been dropping evidence of Katara rejecting Aang. They've been dropping evidence of Katara actually manipulating, I would argue, Aang's emotional state to keep him interested enough so that he gives his best during the fight with Fire Lord Ozai. They have been dropping evidence throughout the series that Aang frequently falls back into his own mind and sees things that aren't representative of reality. He has nightmares that aren't real. He has dreams that aren't real. He has hallucinations that are not real. So the writers have been very cleverly paving a little off-ramp, a little alternative explanation to explain what we see at the end of the show. And whenever I look at the entire series as a whole, and I bring in what we would typically expect from a teenage romance, and how teenage romances tend to work. And let me just remind you, teenage romances are based largely on physical attractiveness. Not on status, not on resources, not on power, not on influence, not on being the avatar, no. Immature minds don't value that in the same way that they value outright, raw, visceral, sexual, physical attractiveness. Teenage minds are far more interested in finding someone who matches physically, who qualifies physically. When we get into adult relationships, that's different. Status, power, influence, and resource acquisition and defense are very important for the man. We've talked about this a shit ton on the show, folks. Go back through the channel. You will see loads of case studies, loads of episodes where we talk about man-woman dynamics and about how important acquiring and defending resources is for a man's mate value. For a man's mate value. Aang is a boy. He's not a man. Katara is a girl, not a woman. And there are fundamental differences in terms of physical and psychological development between men and boys, between women and girls. And that leads to relationships and behaviors within relationships that look distinct. Why is it, folks, that most teenage relationships end up in heartache? Why does this happen? Think about it. Why do most teenage relationships end up with someone having their heart broken? I'll explain it very simply. Calibration. One or both parties have discovered that they actually qualify for someone who's more attractive than the current person that they have. And what ends up happening? They dump the person. This comes from experience, market feedback. That experience and feedback from the marketplace in the dating arena allows you to calibrate. If you are an 8 out of 10 and you're dating a 6, but you're getting signals from other 8s and 9s out of 10 that are interested in you, you're going to dump the 6. Of course you are. If you're a teenager and if you're a teenager, let's imagine you're a teenage girl who's an 8 out of 10, like Katara. And let's say you're dating some dude who's a 5 or 6 out of 10. But because you're inexperienced and because you haven't fully developed yet, physically and psychologically, you're not fully calibrated. But let's imagine when you start going out into the dating arena, you start to get signals from other from other boys who are 8s and 9s out of 10. Do you think that's going to change your perspective towards the 5 that you're dating? Of course it is. You're going to dump them because you're getting feedback that you could do better. And when you get feedback that you can do better, you recalibrate where you are sitting in the marketplace. That 8 out of 10 girl might have incorrectly thought that she was a 6. And that's why she's dating this dude who's a 6 or a 5. But once she starts to go out into the marketplace and starts to get feedback from other dudes, from other boys, and once she starts to realize, holy fuck, I can do better than this 5. I can do better than this 6. I'm getting feedback from boys who are 8s and 9s. I'm going to dump them. Cue the teenage heartache. You know, the poor 5 or 6 out of 10 boy, he goes home weeping and crying And it can happen the reverse way too, folks. I'm just using this as a basic example. So folks, I mean, that's what that is why there's so much turbulence in people's teenage years. Why? Why is there so much heartache? Why are teenagers unable to correctly assess the person on the other side who they are dating? Why does it more often than not end up in heartache? Because they aren't calibrated. And if you've got a conscientious young girl like Katara, a very attractive but conscientious young girl like Katara, you would expect her, given how conscientious and smart she is, you would expect her to not just outright dump Aang. That would be inconsistent with her character. You would expect someone like Katara to say something like, "I'm confused." In other words, she's not telling Aang outright that he's rejected. She's trying to make it out like, "Oh, it's nothing to do with you, Aang. It's just I'm confused. I'm confused, Aang. No, it's not that I'm rejecting you, Aang. It's just I'm confused. Leave it with me, Aang. Give me a little time to sort of process my emotions." The timing isn't right. This is exactly what I would expect from an attractive, conscientious, smart young girl who has a young boy interested in her. She doesn't want to break his heart. She doesn't want to be mean and cruel, but she knows that she needs to keep the young boy interested so that he can accomplish the task in hand. That is exactly, from my perspective, what Katara is doing. Her brains and her conscientiousness will have her thread the needle to try and essentially obtain the outcome that she wants to obtain, which is defeating the Fire Lord. And if that means manipulating Aang's emotional state, so be it. You know, once the war finishes, we can deal with all that other stuff after the war. But for me, that doesn't sound like someone who is head over heels in love with Aang. No, not at all. That sounds like someone who's smart and conscientious, and who is more mature than Aang, who is more physically attractive than Aang, and knows what's at stake, broadly speaking, in the context of the show. Knows what's at stake if Aang isn't on his A game. She has identified a very important thing in Aang. She has identified that Aang is interested in her, and now she needs to be very careful. She's walking on ice. She needs to be very careful about how she deals with Aang to ensure that Aang is heading into his final battle to save the world against Fire Lord Ozai. She needs to ensure that he is going into that battle thinking that Katara will be there waiting for him after the war. And I think what you're seeing in the final scene of Avatar, The Last Airbender, I think what you're seeing is, you are seeing an exhausted Aang. Because remember, Aang didn't just defeat Fire Lord Ozai. He energy banded Fire Lord Ozai. That's never been done before by an Avatar. I don't think it has. And you'll remember what the lion turtle said to Aang. In order to energy band, you must basically have, I'm not going to quote this exactly right, but you basically need an unbreakable spirit yourself. To be able to energy band another bender, you need to have a pure, unbreakable spirit yourself. Otherwise, the darkness will consume you. And you will die. Aang energy bending Ozai, I have no doubt that really took it out of Aang. Because remember, it's the first time Aang has ever energy banded anyone. And that's on top of the big battle that he just had with Ozai. So not only has he had a big, exhausting, difficult battle with Ozai, but then he energy bends him at the very end. Folks, I think what you're seeing at the end of the show is you are seeing an exhausted Aang who has accepted the fact that he is not qualifying for Katara. I think he has accepted it. I think to some degree he's actually at peace with the fact that he doesn't qualify for Katara. I think you can sort of get that vibe when he's up on stage with Zuko at the Fire Nation coronation ceremony, or the Fire Lord coronation ceremony. The vibe I get off Aang, it's one of a person who hasn't got the outcome they wanted, but they are at peace with it. And they are no longer needy and desperate to pursue something that ought not to be pursued right now. Aang sort of looks like he has made peace with the fact that he's not going to get with Katara. And I think that's why the writers don't show any on-screen interaction or dialogue between Aang and Katara. I don't think that's an accident, folks. I think that's deliberate. Now, it flies over most people's heads because they don't want to see it. You know, most people don't want to see it. Most people just want to believe that it's the fairy tale ending. But I don't think that's an accident. I think Aang, when he's up there with Zuko, he looks resigned, but not in a negative way. He looks like he has resigned himself to the fact that he doesn't qualify romantically for Katara right now. And he's being a professional. He's not being needy. He's not throwing a tantrum. He's not imposing himself on Katara. No, he's exhausted, he's tired, and he's respectful of Katara's decision. And he's going to get up there, he's going to be the Avatar, he's going to be a professional at this Fire Lord coronation ceremony with Zuko. He's going to do what he needs to do, say what he needs to say, and then in this sort of exhausted, depleted state, I think what you're then seeing is, in the final scene, in Ba Sing Se, at Arrow's tea shop, you are seeing Aang dreaming. You're seeing him conjuring the finale to the war that he actually wanted but didn't get. He wanted to get the girl of his dreams after the war finished. I don't think he got her. And I think we have enough evidence throughout all of the seasons to at least consider this as a conclusion. To at least consider that Aang is fabricating the scene that he wanted to see play out in reality. He wanted to go out onto that balcony with the sun setting. The war has been ended. Fire Lord Ozai has been defeated. Aang was successful in essentially restoring balance to the world. And I think what you're seeing is, you're seeing Aang play out in his mind the final piece of the puzzle that was actually missing from reality. The final piece of the puzzle being that he gets together with the girl that he always wanted to be with. And I think it's a dream. I don't think it's real. When we look at the lighting of the scene, when we look at how the characters are presented, how they are acting, when we look at how Aang and Katara interact during the scene, no words exchanged, just glances and a final kiss. And then when we consider the fact that Katara doesn't actually speak with Aang on screen at any stage since the Ember Island beach party and the Ember Island sort of argument that they had, we don't get any on-screen time where they talk after Fire Lord Ozai is defeated. When we pull all this together, folks, I cannot see how this is a scene that's based in reality. I cannot see how Aang and Katara's final scene is actually based in reality. It actually looks very improbable. It's the most likely explanation from my perspective. But anyway, that's just what the Bandido thinks. There would be a whole bunch of people, in fact most people, will think it's a load of nonsense what I'm saying. You know, I'd love, if someone has made it 2 hours and 16 minutes into this show, I would love to know, down in the comments, who agrees and who disagrees. And give me your logic for why you agree or disagree. I'd love to hear it. Because I've read some very interesting explanations to try and explain why Aang and Katara are actually a good match. None of them wash with me. And I think the writers would do. And I think that's great. Because whether you agree or disagree with me, the fact that they have left that as a possibility. That's all you can ask for when you're analysing the performance of the writers. That's all you can ask for, is to just leave it as a potential option on the table. So good on the writers. I'm sure it wasn't an easy decision for them to make, to provide this off-ramp, to provide this alternative, because I've no doubt, there would have been pressure to make this cut and dry. There would have been pressure to make this final scene look as though it was absolutely based in reality. And everybody will have their own opinion, and I'm sure the writers of the show have their own opinion. Maybe some of the writers think that it did happen. I honestly don't care if they do or not. Because folks, when you make your art public, it's no longer yours. Everybody knows this. Any person, any creative person knows this. When you release a song, when you release a painting, when you release a movie, when you release a TV series, when you release your art out into the world for an audience to consume, it's no longer yours. Sure, you may have created the art, you may have been the, originator of the idea, but once you put it out into the public marketplace, people are going to take that art and make it their own. They are going to interpret the art in the way that their own personality and life experience will have them interpret it. In other words, the art is no longer yours. When you put the art out there, in this case a TV series, it's totally subjective. People can interpret this in whatever way they want to interpret it, and they can fill in the blanks. If it's well written, they will be able to fill in the blanks, however it is they choose to fill them in. And so the audience ends up making the series their own, in their own way, even though they didn't write it. And every artist, every creator knows this. When you release your art, it takes on a life of its own. And the public will breathe new life into it. And things that you may not have even considered in your own work, theories and offshoot possibilities, things that you weren't even considering, will come from the audience, from their own interpretation. The audience will take your piece of art and they will interpret it in whatever way they want to interpret it. So I applaud the writers. This is why I think the show is fucking great. The Last Airbender, it's great. Because they leave enough ambiguity, just like Christopher Nolan, so that the audience has enough blank spaces in the story to fill in. And look what ends up happening. The Bandido does a 2-hour, 20-minute show, giving his interpretation, because it is open for interpretation. It is open for debate. It's exactly the same as Inception. You know the spinning top at the end of Inception with Christopher Nolan? Having this scene with Leonardo DiCaprio and his children, and he has the spinning top. Is Cobb in reality, or is he in the dream world? It's very similar to actually what we talked about here with Aang and Katara. Are they in reality, or are they in Aang's own dream world? Where Aang is the master creator of the scene, and he has the scene play out the way he wants it to play out. It's the same with Interstellar, another Christopher Nolan movie. When you get to the end of the movie, is that actually real? Did Cooper actually survive the 7-dimensional space that he falls into, or whatever the fuck it was? Does he actually survive and make it out and back to the space station? Or is that also Cooper entering into a dream state before he dies? And you're seeing a dream. There's enough little nuances in the portrayal of the last 10 or 15 minutes of Interstellar to make the audience consider that the final scene is a dream. It's the same with The Dark Knight Rises, another Christopher Nolan movie. Is Bruce Wayne actually there in the restaurant as Alfred looks across his table towards Bruce? Or is that a dream that Alfred is conjuring up? Because as we know, earlier in the movie, Alfred talks about how he would dream of looking across and seeing Bruce there with a wife and maybe a few kids. You are primed. Nolan has you primed from early in the movie that this could be a dream. Just like the Avatar writers throughout the seasons have been priming you. They have been sowing the seeds of a dream scene at the end. Now, whether it is a dream scene or not, that's up to interpretation of each individual who analyzes and views the show. But it's definitely there as a possibility, folks. You cannot deny that. Whether you agree or disagree is another thing. But you cannot deny that there is evidence. There is good evidence that Aang and Katara's scene at the end is a dream. Do you agree or disagree? I don't know. Let me know down in the comments. Folks, that's the end of our show. Let us have a look here. Have we got anybody in the live chat? It looks like we do have someone in the live chat. Let me bring this up here and have a look. Let's see. Who have we got a live chat from? It's Quiz22. Quiz22. He's down in the chat. Let's see what Quiz to say. He says the following. The knowledge on this could be a mastermind topic for the Bandido Avatar. Well, look, I've only watched the show 3 times. I think I would probably need to watch the show a few more times for me to absolutely encapsulate all of the nuances. I'd probably need to do a little bit of reading up as well. But you know, having watched the show through in the last month, certainly when it comes to, folks, when it comes to man, woman, boy, girl, in this case dynamics, there are fundamental principles of human nature as we can understand it. And you know, I'm not saying that you have to be an evolutionary psychologist to have to understand any of this stuff. It's more just, you can even think of your own experience. Fuck the science, fuck the evolutionary psychology. Just think of it from your own perspective. Either when you were a teenager, or perhaps when you're watching your own kids grow up as teenagers. Think about what teenage relationships are like. You know, is it a stretch, folks, to say that teenage relationships that are happening between kids in their early teens, is it a stretch to say that those relationships are in some way distinct to that of adult relationships? Of course they are. Is there overlap? Yes, there is. But there's a distinct difference between a juvenile relationship, a teenage relationship, and a fully grown, fully matured, fully physically developed relationship between 2 adults. So that's how I'm analysing this. That's how I'm analysing Aang and Katara, through that lens. And you know, knowledge on the show in general, well look, I really enjoy some of the plot points. I enjoy how the characters, many of the characters, how they were portrayed. In fact, one of the great things that Avatar did was how they actually introduced female characters into positions of power. They actually did a really good job with that. Because it can come across really fucking woke when you start having women going around, you know, beating up dudes. That is very risky terrain. But I thought Avatar did a really good job with all of its female characters. They integrated them into those power dynamics really well. You know, a mastermind topic, I would probably need to watch the series a few more times. You know, this is the first time in, it could be 6 years. The first time in 6 years that I've actually rewatched the series. I think I watched Avatar around COVID. I'm almost sure. So it's been a long time since I've seen the series. I would probably need to watch it a few more times to claim a position of being in, you know, the mastermind chair, answering questions. But look, really good show. Lots to learn from the show. I mean, there are so many angles that you can analyze the show from. But anyway, mastermind, I don't know. Maybe Quiz 22 is overestimating the Bandido's capabilities when it comes to analysing Avatar: The Last Airbender. But anyway, that seems like our only live chat, folks. Let me bring this out of the road here. And that draws our show to a close. Holy fuck, 2 hours and 27 minutes. It's been a long one, folks. These reviews, these deep dives into TV series and movies, they take a while, folks. They really do. But look, if you've made it this far, folks, feel free to give us a thumbs up, give us a like, give us a thumbs down. If you are what is it they say, a Kataang? If you are a Kataang if you belong to this broad group that we call Kataang, these people who think Aang and Katara were just destined for one another in the series, let me remind you folks, I am basing my conclusions off the 3 seasons, not what happens later. I'll repeat one last time. I don't have a problem, in principle, with a more physically mature, psychologically mature Aang and Katara getting together. That's different. I'm basing my entire analysis off the Last Airbender series, 3 seasons. Water, earth, and fire. That's it. But anyway, if you thought it was worth a thumbs up, you can give it a thumbs up. If it is due a thumbs down, feedback from the marketplace, folks. Feedback. Hit the thumbs down button too. As I've said, get down into the comments section. Let me know what you thought. Agree or disagree, leave those insights down there. And then finally, folks, you know, if you like in general what we do here at Bandido Talks, folks, we've got a shit ton of content up on the channel here on YouTube. You know, subscribe to the YouTube channel, Bandido Talks. We're uploading maybe 3 or 4 videos a week on a whole variety of different things. You know, we cover so many topics on the show. So if you want to be updated, notified about upcoming live shows, about any of our uploads, or YouTube shorts, whatever it may be, subscribe to the channel, folks. We are also live over on Rumble. You can see it down here on the scrolling black banner. You know, we do different live shows over on Rumble. They are more political. They are more US-based stories. So, you know, if you want a wee bit more political stuff, stories that are more US-based, head over to Rumble. Subscribe over to Bandido Talks. Or sorry, subscribe on Bandido Talks over on Rumble. I think we've got over 40 live shows over on Rumble. Completely different live shows, folks. You know, we've got, what is this? This is our 75th live show here on YouTube. We've got over 40 live shows. Completely different live shows over on Rumble. So head over to Rumble, check out our live content over there. More political, more US based. Subscribe, Bandido Talks on YouTube, on Rumble. Again, you can see, where is it? X. You can follow over on X as well. You know, should I probably post a bit more on X? Maybe I should, but I don't really like written commentary. It takes too long. It's too tedious. Writing and typing on your phone. You know, follow over on X because, you know, we can always notify you of an upcoming live show. If for that reason alone, that's probably reason enough to follow over on X. So look, that's where Bandido Talks can be found. That is everything from me this Friday evening. At this stage, what is it? 6:10? Friday evening, folks. Enjoy the rest of your evening. You know, enjoy your incoming weekend. It's pretty toasty here at the moment in Ireland. Not that sunny, but pretty warm. So you enjoy the rest of your incoming weekend. That's everything from me, folks. And with all of that said, it is over and out. This week on YouTube, live from the Bandido.